Hello, and welcome back to Dave's American Flyer Trains for the continuation of the rebuild of twin Missouri Pacific PA Alco units 29919 and 29919-1, which is the dummy unit. These are classified by Doyle as Type 2 from 1959 and 1960. First, a little housekeeping regarding tools and materials, and then also about some tracking issues with diesels. If you don't have one, build one or buy one, some sort of cradle that you can place your locomotives upside down to gain access to them, or even right side up, and even your rolling stock. Now this one was built by a friend of mine, a late friend of mine, who made this one in the early 1980s. And he did so with 1x4s, some carpet, remnant carpet, and a little piece of naugahyde. I think that's what that is. It looks like the kind of covering that you'd put on the old 1970s and 80s types of kitchen chairs. He simply pinched the material between these two rails and screwed them in. He made the U-shaped cradle here. He lined it with carpet because he liked to store tools in his. In other words, he would take this with him to on-site or move it around his own layout to do work, and he put tools in here. And he found that just carpeting the inside of it made the tools such that they really aided the ability for the tools not to slide. So it kept them in place. It's a really simple device. This one is about 24 inches long, and I've had it a long time, since the early 1980s. Now, even recently, I've had some issues, and as I have had throughout the lifetime of my collection and layout, issues with diesel locomotive, whether they be GP7 or Alco, which are the only two that I have. I do not have a Baldwin. Derailment and performance. Most of these issues have focused around grade changes, upgrade or coming down a grade, or the changing of the grade at the apex. Switches, right or left in either direction, curve track, and then specialized track sections, such as re-railers. Not limited to re-railers, but that's just one example. Now, believe it or not, I've found several things that I do that have aided the performance and actually got the performance of these to be very consistent, and that what I found as being problematic. In no particular order, they are the gauge of the wheels. Now, I use Mr. Barker's simple dime test. First thing is, I check the gauge by simply putting the dime between the wheels and make sure it's snug, but it has some movement to it. If I'm going to either tighten the grade up or reduce or spread it out just a little bit, I keep the dime in place, maybe holding it with tape, so that I know when I'm through either pulling the wheels apart a little bit further or pressing them together a little bit closer. Again, I never put it so close that the dime can't move a little bit. Another one are the steps. Now, this one does not have the external separately attached steps as you find on the earlier Alco diesels. These steps are built into the molding on the body. But where there's the separate steps held in by rivets or pins, I've found that sometimes these steps get pinched in through handling or storage, whatever reason, such that it impacts the lateral movement of the truck and therefore its ability to take a curve or go over specialized track. And I simply bend those out a little bit, holding the base carefully or removing them, such that I bend them out just a little bit. Now, they're not really that noticeable to the naked eye, but if you know that it's there, you'll see it. You'll see them bent inward a little bit, and you'll know how much to build them, to pull them out and improve that lateral movement. Another issue I've made adjustments to are on the truck and collector assembly are these side frames, these centered iron side frames, and that is they rotate too much on this frame, meaning they rotate like this, simply because the centered iron attachment points have begun to degrade and don't fit as tight. I've had these move so much that they could touch I found them so much that they can actually touch the power wheels. Now, that was primarily a performance issue, but I found it by taking the truck and collector assembly off with these screws, and I've noticed that there's black rings or black spots on there where the wheels are touching or shorting out. So it was evident about which way the rotation was going. Now I simply used JB Weld or Crazy Glue, cleaned them thoroughly first with including contact cleaner, the points of attachment, put in the adhesive, clamped them such that they were hopefully at 90 degrees and let them dry overnight, at least 24 hours, and it greatly improved the performance. One more item about changing the range of motion of a truck on a diesel unit. Now, what I'm not addressing, of course, in these little steps that I have described that might change the range of motion is nothing about the switch or specialized section of track or anything else. I've had to make adjustments on those, but I'm not going into that right now. But they certainly do contribute sometimes to the inability of these trains to negotiate those sections of track and require adjustments. However, there are these adjustments I've shared with you, plus one more, and that is on these diesels, there are tabs right at the top of the motor assembly, right at the yoke, where the yoke attaches to the chassis. There are tabs usually on either side of a horizontal tab. I'm going to put the pointer on the horizontal tab right there, which is attached to the yoke assembly. And then there's vertical tabs that are attached to the chassis. Now as I rotate the motor, you can see that horizontal tab butting up against those tabs that are dropped down from the chassis that impact the range of motion. And I found that sometimes it's simply because that is their inability to negotiate some sections of track is simply because it lacks range of motion, and sometimes I have found that adjusting these tabs really helps. For example, you can take both or one or the other, whichever one is, you might say, depending on if it's a right hand or left hand curve, you simply take needle nose pliers, hold this tab right here and bend it up, pushing it closer to the chassis in small increments until you find the right position that allows the locomotive to adjust the curve. I did this recently with a train that's been on my layout for quite some time, but it had never negotiated a particular switch in this particular direction, that it was giving me a problem on a curve, and I found that eventually it was range of motion. I took needle nose pliers, bent one of these two tabs up, increasing the range of motion in one direction until it could negotiate that curve. Now, of course, you might say, well, why didn't it do that on all the curves? Well, again, these curves, kind of like the trains have, these switches, kind of like the trains, have personalities, and they each sometimes require their own adjustments. And it just so happened on this particular switch, it needed it was a tighter radius. And this particular tab, I simply kept pushing it up toward the chassis, bending it up toward the chassis in small increments, which allowed a greater range of motion. Let's say if I was doing the one closest to the lens in this direction, it allowed it a greater range of motion. Don't bend them a long way. Don't bend them all the way up. Just do it in small increments until it finally starts to work. Okay. By the way, this is my train cradle turned upside down. Makes a very nice little stand for doing up close work. Now I'm going to start with this dummy A unit, it's disassembly, by removing the truck and collector assemblies so that I can inspect them thoroughly, even looking at some of the issues that I just mentioned, and clean them thoroughly and remove them. And that involves, first of all, making sure that I have the right tools. What aids greatly in the disassembly of any of these trains or reassembly is having a magnetic screwdriver. Now this happens to be one of my favorite screwdrivers because of the diameter of the shaft and the size of the flathead. And in order to make it magnetic, I don't have to run to the hardware store and get a marked magnetic screwdriver. You can make one yourself. I take a strong magnet, which is used for the storage of this tool. It's right there. It's a fairly strong magnet, and in order to make it magnetic, the screwdriver magnetic, you simply take the base of the shaft, put it on the magnet, and pull it down, and then rotate the shaft of the screwdriver either 1/3, 1/6, or 1/8. I try to do it about 4 times per side, you might say, so I do 8 rotations. I think this is going to be the 8th one right there. That creates the magnetic screwdriver. And let's see if that magnetized the screwdriver. Voila! It works very nicely. So I do all my flathead screwdrivers with a little bit of magnetism.